We're joined by Marianne Voss, a partner with Ethos Matters. She's also a consultant to Sedex, and you're taking part in a session today, Marianne, about worker voice and worker voice technologies. In its narrowest sense, that's about polling and drawing data and information from workers, whether they're being paid on time, if they're earning more money. But there are wider applications to that than that.
Absolutely. So some of the wider applications they're essentially around four. So one is using social media vehicles to allow workers to interact with each other around critical issues. For example, recruitment. What are their experiences in working with labor providers? An example of that is My Labor Matters in the Japan-Philippine corridor. Others are using it in terms of worker hotlines as one set of tools. Open Dev in India is in that, where it's essentially a grievance mechanism for workers. Another example is using online platforms as sort of human resources, worker well-being, worker education, and training programs as part of a human resources management strategy.
There's a huge opportunity here for technology companies, a proliferation really of platforms that could be used for these purposes. But how do you make sure that all of those technology providers are singing from the same song sheet?
Yeah, I think it's a big challenge right now since a lot of the technology providers are brand and supplier driven, so they're unique to the needs of that individual brand. Some technology providers are creating essentially aggregate data that allows benchmarking across industry peers, sort of like a Yelp type thing, so CDM in Latin America, as well as Labor Voices are examples of that. But there's also a new initiative called the West Principles, which is seeking to create guidance around how technology providers and users of those technology providers can ensure the implementation of this intervention is done in a way that is inclusive of worker input, ensures security of the data, as well as drives the use of the data that's collected to ensure impact for workers.
How do you ensure that workers are confident enough to use these technologies? Because there may be a reluctance if they feel that there's going to be some kind of kickback, if they speak up, if their identity becomes known.
Yeah. See, this is where technology is usually insufficient, right? So you can create a platform, doesn't mean that workers will use it. So there are different mechanisms for doing that. I think the biggest mechanism up front is to be able to demonstrate that their interaction with that technology is actually driving to change that's going to be beneficial for them.
So you're not just capturing data, you're doing something with it.
So if you have feedback mechanisms that say, here's what we heard, and here's what we're doing about it, and here's our response, and here's how it's benefited, and then you use that same mechanism to then identify impacts, it sort of generates trust over time. Another way is to partner with civil society organizations that already have the trust and relationships with the workers and use them as vehicles for recruiting the use of technology.
I just wondered, though, what the response is of employers to these technologies, because there may be an accusation that these technologies are open to abuse, that a worker could make a claim that isn't substantiated, but it nonetheless forms part of that data. How do you do the due diligence around that?
Well, honestly, I think that if you're doing worker surveys that just captures data, it probably needs to be complementary to audits and other form of independent identification. So true audits look at multiple sources of data and triangulate findings to identify documentation support, other interviews with workers support, or system support for particular claims. So I think it's one source of data or one source of intelligence that provides insight for further action. So by itself, it's not useful, if that makes sense.
Yeah. In terms of cultures, though, around the world, do you notice any sort of geographical differences in certain parts of the world are more willing to engage in these forms of technology, this way of reporting?
Yes and no. I think that, certainly if you look at the West, workers are on their phones all the time. In other places in developing countries, we found it's actually surprising that folks are skipping to that and immediately going into technology in order to interact with their peers, but not necessarily with their employers. So we're back to the original question around how do you gender trust through workers, by demonstrating impact or by working through relationships that workers already trust in order to get that use in place.
Marianne Voss from Ethos Matters, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks.